We all come from different cultures, different backgrounds. I'm from the US, but my wife is from the Republic of Congo in Central Africa. And so when we got married, there were certain cultural assumptions that we made that actually didn't apply to each other. I would say, I love you, and the expected response in my culture, which I thought was transcultural, was, I love you too. But instead, my wife would say, thank you. I was horrified. I thought my wife didn't love me. But after a while, we got to talking about it and realized that just the expected responses in our different cultures was different. Well, how much more is it difficult to understand somebody's culture if you can't converse with them, if in fact they've been dead for a couple thousand years? And that's the situation we're often in with the Bible. Of course, we can talk with the author, with God, but in terms of the other people in the Bible, well, they've been dead for a couple thousand years. And therefore, to understand their culture, we really need to have some background. And that's what this video is about the importance of getting cultural background for the Bible. For years, once I realized the need for background, I began digging through ancient sources until finally I had, back then we didn't have computers, so 70,000 index cards, and eventually 100,000 index cards. And at that point, I decided somebody needs to make all this available to people, to put it at their fingertips. So the parts in the Bible that we don't understand, the things that the biblical writers didn't have to explain because they could simply take them for granted, well, we could just make that available to everybody, put it in one book, put it at people's fingertips. And so that's what I eventually sought to do when I wrote the Bible background commentary, which is now published by Vida Nova. And I'm going to be speaking about Bible background at some different places in Brazil, sponsored by Vida Nova, so that people can see the value of the background commentary and make use of that background. You know, you can see in the Bible that sometimes they took for granted certain cultural assumptions. For example, Mark chapter 7, Mark explains some background. He explains a Pharisaic custom. But Matthew, who's writing to a Jewish audience in Matthew chapter 15, leaves out that background because, well, his audience already understood it. They didn't need the background explained. There were many elements of ancient Greek and Roman and Egyptian and Jewish culture and other ancient cultures that the authors didn't need to explain because their audience already understood those elements. However, we don't always understand them. So just like we need translations, or we have to read it in the original, in the same way, we either need to know the ancient customs ourselves, or we need to have a resource that puts those ancient customs at our fingertips. These could be footnotes in a study Bible, but at greater length, we've produced the background commentary to cover these things. Now, we could give examples all day long of places where background sheds light on things. Of course, many of the places that are mentioned in the Bible, the people who are mentioned in the Bible, often we have other information about them. Certainly many of the figures in Acts, for example, or Pontius Pilate, or some of the governors of Cyprus, Sergius Paulus, or other places. Later on in Judea, you've got Festus and Felix, and we can learn a lot more about them from studying other ancient historical records and in the background commentary. Many of the symbols in Revelation make really good sense once you understand the background. In the Old Testament, the structure of the tabernacle might be hard to identify with. Why all this elaborate description of the tabernacle? But when you understand how ancient temples were built, then you understand, okay, here's where it's just like an ancient temple, and here's where it diverges from other ancient temples so that you can understand how it's different. For example, the climax of other ancient temples was something like the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, you would have a pedestal, something like the Ark of the Covenant. But on top of that, you would always have the idol, the image of the deity. And so even the very structure of the tabernacle reminds us that we're not to have any graven images. Other ancient Near Eastern and North African temples would often have shrines for assistant deities on either side of the Holy of Holies. But you don't have that in Yahweh's tabernacle or Yahweh's temple, because the very structure of this is showing us that you shall have no other gods in God's sight. And these other ancient Near Eastern temples often would have a bed to put the deity, the idol, to sleep at night, and a chest of drawers and so on, so that when they got the idol up in the morning, they could clothe it after giving it its morning toilet and then entertain it with dancers and so forth. But you don't have any of that in Yahweh's temple, because the God of Israel doesn't need a bed. He neither slumbers nor sleeps. So passage after passage, the background illumines material, or even basic things, like when Paul starts out, Paul, an apostle, and then goes on and talks about the audience, for example, to the believers in Rome. So why were letters written like that? We don't normally write letters that way today. We say, dear so-and-so, or in an email, we say, hi, so-and-so, and then go on and just put our name at the end. But understanding how ancient letters were written makes a difference. And even in Paul's greetings, for example, the ancient Greek greeting was normally greetings, the Greek word chairein. Paul changes that to charis, grace, and then adds the Jewish greeting, peace. Peace was a prayer to God. May there be peace with you. I'm praying to God for peace for you. And added with that, grace. It's a prayer to God. But Paul says, grace and peace to you from God the Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. So it's not simply a prayer to God the Father, but it's also acknowledging Jesus as divine in the introduction to all of Paul's letters, because he's invoking Jesus as divine the same way ancient letters would invoke whatever deity they were believing in. So again and again, this background is really helpful. And we look forward to seeing you at these conferences and to you being able to get some of this material at your fingertips that took years of research to dig out.